LSU lands an Auburn transfer. A blue chip prospect is headed to campus. And which sophomores are set to break out for Brian Kelly's squad in 2024? It's Locked On LSU. Let's get it.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Okay, let's get it. As you heard, it is Locked On LSU. I'm your host, Matt Moscona, pumped to be here with you. I'll remind you probably for at least this week, if you're expecting Caroline Fenton, my apologies. But Caroline, off to a new career opportunity. My name is Matt Moscona. Started this podcast back in 2018, did it for 4 years, went on a 2-year hiatus. Caroline did an awesome job, but now I'm back and I'm fired up to be here. We got a massive show, little baseball news as the roster continues evolving for Jay Johnson. And I want to take a look at a couple of, maybe actually 3 players who might be poised to break out for Brian Kelly's squad in 2024. So we got a ton to do as always. Thanks for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free. We are available wherever you get podcasts. We are on YouTube and part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at eBay Motors and so many other great sponsors we'll be able to tell you about as we move throughout this show today. So let us begin with LSU's baseball roster for 2025 continuing to take shape. Jay Johnson landed an SEC edition out of the transfer portal on Tuesday. And so I know a lot of the complaints from LSU fans about this portal class has been, well, it's all small school guys. Where are the big school players? I'll remind you that, well, Paul Skeens came from Air Force. But nonetheless, as I've said commonly, in particular with pitching, pitching is measurable. There is objective, measurable data when it comes to pitchers. You can measure velocity. You can measure spin rate. You can measure horizontal break. I don't really care where you pitched last year. Do you have that physical ability? If you do, you can work with things. How hitters translate is probably a bigger question as well. There's always the command question with pitchers, but LSU did land a Power 5 transfer. It's Chris Stanfield from Auburn. Now, this name should ring a bell if you're an LSU or SEC baseball fan. So Stanfield was a top 100 overall prospect in the country in the class of 2022. He started 40 games as a freshman on the Plains and then essentially was a 2-year starter. This season for an Auburn team, which was not a great year for Auburn, obviously, Stanfield hit 276, but that's only part of the story with Stanfield. I was texting earlier today with a big league scout who's a buddy and who I lean on a lot for good information, especially when it comes to prospects. And I'll read you directly this text that this person sent me. I'm going to read you. This is from an MLB scout about Chris Stanfield. It's 3 or 4 lines. I'll read it to you. Okay. Stanfield is uber athletic with twitchy moving parts. 70 runner. Their offense didn't steal a ton of bases, but he can. Takes his walks, average on swing and miss. Started as a freshman, made progression year 2. If he doesn't sign, should make another jump as a junior. Double plus defender in the outfield. Can play left and center. Gives LSU a right-handed hitting outfielder. And I asked, essentially, is he a replacement for Paxton Kling? And he said, yes, just as good as Paxton Kling defensively. So that makes a lot of sense, right? Next year, if you're Jay Johnson, you've got Jake Brown coming back, who is likely your day 1 starter in center field, which means Stanfield could battle for left or beat out Jake Brown in center. Brown could go to right. We'll see. You've got Ashton Larson as well. But remember, Brown and Larson, that's 2 left-handed bats in the outfield. So Stanfield does give you a right-handed bat in the outfield, just gives you some versatility. And then a guy, as you heard, will take his walks, will get on base, can steal bases, even though Auburn didn't do that a ton, and Jay Johnson doesn't do that a ton. But how many times did we see Paxton Kling as a late inning defensive replacement, as a pinch runner. Listen, maybe with all of his experience, Chris Stanfield comes in and can win a starting job. It's fair to mention Josh Pearson, and we love playoff Josh Pearson. But when we talk about Josh Pearson, he's also a guy that in 2 years in Baton Rouge has been a 250 hitter, or 3 years in Baton Rouge, been about a 250 hitter for his career. So he's a guy that hasn't really gotten the bat. He's hit in some big spots, but consistently hasn't been there for Pearson. So, and by the way, LSU did face Stanfield in Auburn this year, and Stanfield in that series was 4 of 13 at the plate. So hit over 300 against LSU in that series. So pretty obvious that Jay Johnson got an up-close look at him the past 2 years and liked what he saw. But that's a situation where you're looking at Stanfield as a guy who's a veteran presence, who could come in and compete in your outfield, effectively replacing what you lost in Paxton Kling. A plus defender in the outfield, tons of speed. You need the bat to come along. Sound familiar? That's effectively what you got here in Chris Stanfield from Auburn. So that was a big, big get for Jay Johnson as you continue to fill out this roster. And listen, you've got more than a dozen players that are either going to the draft or out of eligibility, and you've had 10 players hit the portal. So you're talking, depending on what happens with the draft, 22, 25 players on your 40-man roster that are going to turn over. So you've got an incoming freshman class and JUCOs as well, but you have to hit the transfer portal to fill out your roster. Now, I've been asked by a lot of people as well, how did it go this weekend with Gavin Killen on campus? And the unfortunate news for LSU is that it doesn't seem like, it's not to say it went badly, but what you were really hoping for is that Gavin Killen, the Louisville shortstop, who's the number one player in the portal, would have committed. He visited Tennessee during their regional weekend. He visited Vanderbilt as well. He was at LSU this past weekend. And essentially what he said is he wants to take one more visit when the other team finishes their season. Well, that tells you the answer is Texas A&M. So he wants to visit Texas A&M, and that's kind of a bummer because if what Gavin Killen is going after is just a paycheck, A&M is going to write a bigger check than LSU. And if that's the case, then LSU is still searching for a shortstop if, in fact, Michael Braswell signs a pro deal. And it sure seems like Braswell would sign wherever he was drafted. But if you don't get Gavin Killen and you don't feel like you have a great option, you have the opportunity to bring Braswell back for a 4th year in the SEC, a guy that hit over 300 in conference play this year. You'd sure like to do that as an option at this point. But if you can get Gavin Killen, that would be a major win. So if you're asking or wondering, about some of those bigger name prospects and the Power 5 school transfers, where are they? Well, maybe that's part of your answer right now. So you did get Chris Stanfield from Auburn to commit. There was massive news as well for LSU and Jay Johnson with one of the top prospects in all the country saying he's passing on the draft. He's coming to campus. I'll tell you about him as we continue here on Locked on LSU, your team every day. Passion, drive, and patience. That's the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle, level it up to peak performance, superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, you will find it at eBay Motors. They've got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride or every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. It's eBay Motors, proud sponsor here of Locked on LSU, part of the Locked on Podcast Network. So Chris Stanfield commits to LSU via the transfer portal. It's great news for Jay Johnson. Maybe even the better news for Jay Johnson is one of the top prospects in the country, Derek Curiel, has told LSU he's skipping the draft and he's coming to campus. I'll tell you more about him here in a second. As always, if you're listening to us, however you might be listening to us, thank you so much. Please subscribe up on your favorite podcast app. Rate us, leave a review. Let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here weekdays for Locked On LSU. And if you're watching us on YouTube, sincere thanks there as well. Please smash that like button and subscribe to the Locked On LSU YouTube channel. So, speaking of outfielders, Derek Curiel, if you don't follow high school baseball recruiting and the showcases and things like that, then this name may not sound familiar. I think most LSU fans at this point are aware of William Schmidt from Catholic High. You're aware of Cam Caminiti. Some may be aware of Boston Bateman. We talked about Cade Arambidi, the catcher. One of the other highest ranked prospects in this class is Derek Curiel. And he is a guy who, if you look at perfect game prospect rankings, now this is just rankings for high school. This isn't like draft all players. I'll get to that in a second, but just ranking this high school class. Derek Curiel ranks, he's out of California, he's an outfielder, ranks as the number 10 overall player in the country. And as far as the draft, MLB.com ranks him as the number 117 overall draftable prospect. Kylie McDaniel from ESPN projects him as a third-round pick. The same scout I talked to earlier about Chris Stanfield said he'd have Curiel as a third or fourth-round pick. And Curiel shared on his Instagram, and I'll read this directly from his Instagram. After talks with my family, advisors, and loved ones, I have formally withdrawn my name from the 2024 MLB Draft. I will be enrolling early this summer at LSU. Can't wait to get to work. See you soon, Baton Rouge. Go Tigers. So I'll go back to the same scout I spoke to, and I asked about Stanfield. I asked him about Curiel. He said, Derek will play as a freshman, but really needs to get stronger to impact the ball hitting. Best guess, part-time starter as a freshman, takes off sophomore year or even late freshman year. I said, kind of like Jake Brown. Said, yes, similar Brown, but Brown is stronger and has more power. So you're talking about a guy that is a plus defender in the outfield, good bat, needs to get a little stronger. But again, a guy that is a top 10 prospect in the country coming out of high school by perfect game. And if he does actually make it to campus, then that would be a major, major win. And it would be on par, if you're just talking again about high school prospects, on par with what you lost last year with Cam Johnson, who was the highest rated prospect ever to show up on campus. So now, again, he's not a top 10 draft prospect. And that's where Cam Johnson was. Cam Johnson was talked about a year ago as a top half of round one guy in the draft. Curiel's looking at like a third, fourth round pick, which would probably net him somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000. But think of it this way. This is the decision Dylan Cruz made 4 years ago now. Dylan was a highly rated guy. He had his number. He didn't get it. So comes to LSU. He starts for 3 years. He wins a national championship. He wins a Golden Spikes Award. He gets NIL deals. He's a legend in LSU forever. He got to fly private, stay in nice hotels, avoid long bus rides. And by the way, in his first minor league season, Dylan Cruz is already in AAA, and it's June. So that's a pretty strong story to be able to tell if you're Jay Johnson, to go talk to a guy like Derek Curiel and say, come to the SEC, play in front of 10,000 fans every night, face the level of pitching you're going to face in AA every night, get better, avoid the long bus rides, make some NIL money as well, get a college degree. Look at all the things that you can sell. Just look at Dylan Cruz. By the way, there was a really nice picture of Curiel from his recruiting visit with Dylan Cruz, from one of his first, his commitment visit with Dylan Cruz. So yeah, I would say that Dylan probably has a very compelling story to tell to a young guy like Derek Curiel. Now, where would he factor into the outfield next year? That's a really good question. And I can't tell you definitively that I have that answer, because you would be talking again about already returning Jake Brown, Ashton Larson, Josh Pearson. Now you bring in Chris Stanfield and then Curiel as well. So I don't know that you're looking at a guy that necessarily is a day one starter in the outfield, but maybe by the end of the season, you could see that happen. Now, it's also worth mentioning that at this point, a year ago, nobody thought Stephen Milam was going to be an everyday starter as a true freshman, and especially as poor a fall as Stephen Milam had. But Milam became a guy that you just could not justify taking out of the lineup. I know the heroics at the end of the season with the walk-off homers, but if you go back and remember the opening weekend of this season, Milam was just that dirtbag, tough player at second base, got on base, he gave you competitive ABs, and you just couldn't justify taking him out of the lineup. And he justified that throughout the entire season. So we'll see how this all transpires. But the other word of caution, and I'm not trying to be a poo-pooer, I'm just laying this out there. While Stanfield says he's formally withdrawn from the draft, there is no, Curiel, there is no such thing as formally withdrawing from the draft. You can't formally take it's not like in the NBA where you put your name in and then you decide you're returning to school, so you withdraw from the draft. In baseball, there is no such thing. If you're a draft eligible, like a major league team could draft me if they wanted to. Now, obviously they won't, but they could. I mean, we've seen players who played other sports get drafted just because they could. Teams would take a flyer. Now, it was easier when you had a more expanded draft. But if Derek Curiel can say, I'm going to LSU, that's great. But I've got a long list of examples of players who said the exact same thing who ended up signing. Zach Von Rosenberg, Brody Colvin had both given Paul Maneri assurances they were coming. And draft rolled around. They got a phone call, were offered more money than they expected, and they signed. Zach Lee. Remember Zach Lee? Zach Lee was a two-sport guy, played quarterback, got drafted by the Dodgers. Zach Lee was literally going through fall camp football with LSU. LSU, when they had football media days back then, I interviewed Zach Lee, talked to him about, what's your number? What are you thinking? And he obviously was very well coached up for all that stuff. But one day Derek Lee was there, and the next day he wasn't. They offered him $6 million, and he said, I will take $6 million, and I won't play college football. I mean, there are Christian Cairo. This is another example. Christian Cairo, the son of Miguel Cairo, a former major leaguer. Christian Cairo was on campus. He was on the story goes, and this was Nolan Kane told me the story. Nolan recruited him. He was literally on campus registering for classes. On campus, like in line, registering for classes. Phone rings, and it was his agent, and he got an offer that he didn't think he was going to get. Had to make a split decision. Boom, gone. Just left. So I understand the excitement, and you should be excited. But it is worth mentioning that we see this from time to time with elite level prospects who have their mind made up. They're going to school. They come to campus. But all that does is just give them even more leverage in negotiations with teams. I'm not saying Derek Curiel's using LSU to get more money. I'm just saying sometimes you have a motivated team. And if he's got a number in his head that he has to consider and that number comes along, he might consider it, might just take it. It's why you have to sweat out the draft. As unfortunate as that is from a college baseball perspective, you still sometimes just have to sweat out the draft. And so we'll see how that all ends up transpiring here for Jay Johnson as the draft comes in early mid-July and the month that follows as we approach that signing deadline. Okay, we're glad you're aboard with us here on Locked on LSU. I do have a football note that I'd like to get to put a button on today's episode, so don't you move. Saw this piece at CBS Sports today, and they were looking at a list of second-year college football players poised for breakout. They called it college football second-year breakout stars. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole list. It's a lot of guys you probably don't know or care about. One of them you do know is Lance Hurd. It's interesting, of course. I mean, he was a 5-star. He's now at Tennessee. So he is plug and play day one starting left tackle over at Tennessee. So, we'll see how all that transpires with him. But the one that'll maybe be of most interest to you is Deshaun Womack. Deshaun Womack was a 5-star in LSU's 2023 class. And I know I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again for those that have missed it. Deshaun Womack, I remember Brian Kelly's been great with media availability and practice access and letting us come watch practice. And one of the first days of pads, they were in the indoor, and the media goes up to the catwalk in the indoor. So we're up like on the catwalk that rings the top of the indoor facility. So we're watching from on top. And it was in the end zone on the side that butts up the football ops, and it was on the far side. And Deshaun Womack, the defensive linemen were working on 2-on-1 drills. 2 offensive linemen, 1 defensive lineman. Basically, they had to split a double team. That was the drill. And Deshaun Womack got tossed around like a rag doll. Now, this was August, right? This is right before his freshman season. And it didn't mean he wouldn't be a great player. It just meant he was way too light to help you at all in the running game, meaning he was just going to be a pass rusher, an edge rushing specialist as a freshman, which is what he was. And he played in 12 games, and he had 13 tackles, 1.5 for loss. He had 1.5 sacks. So it's just what he did sort of as he transitioned there in his freshman season. But Brian Kelly, after spring, sort of gushed about Womack, and he is backing up Braden Swinson. So on the defensive line, you got Savion Jones as the left defensive end. Braden Swinson is your right defensive end. Paris Shand is the number 2 left defensive end. And Deshaun Womack ran as the number 2 right defensive end. So I think we are going to see a lot of Deshaun Womack this year in that rotation. So I don't hate this decision by CBS to put Deshaun Womack on this list. I just don't think that's the guy that's going to be the breakout star among second-year players for LSU in 2024. Primarily because he's behind Braden Swinson. And Swinson's your starter and is probably your best edge rusher. So I just think reps are going to be hard to come by with respect to Harold Perkins' different position. I'll give you 2 guys that I think are absolutely poised to have monster second years in Baton Rouge. And I'll remind you, of the class that Brian Kelly signed in 2023, 9 of those players are already gone. Some of them Jaylen Brown, Kai Preon, Christian Braithwaite. You know the list. 9 players from that class are already gone. Of Jackson Howard, Jackson McGowan. Anyway. But I give you 2 guys from that class a year ago who I think are poised for monster years. One of them is DJ Chester. DJ Chester is a sophomore who is going to be your starting center. And we just may not talk about him because offensive linemen don't put up stats. And on that offensive line, you've got 2 bookend tackles that are going to be first-round draft picks. And you've got 2 guards that have been starters for 4 years in Miles Frazier and Garrett Dellinger. So you bring in a sophomore in DJ Chester who's going to touch the ball every play and be part of your battery, but he's going to be surrounded by great experienced talent that's going to lift him up and help him along in this first year as a starter. But if he's healthy, he's starting every game for you at center. So DJ Chester is one I would give you. But the actual answer, if you just look at it as second-year breakout stars, the answer is Caleb Jackson. A year ago, LSU had 8 running backs, 8 scholarship running backs. All throughout fall camp, Brian Kelly kept getting asked, how are you going to manage 8 running backs? How in the world are you going to get 8 guys touches? How are you going to keep everybody happy? And Kelly's answer was always, this works itself out. The cream rises, the veterans usually win it out. And he was right. And we saw how it transpired. Logan Diggs and Josh Williams are your primary rushers. John Emery was a really good change of pace until he got injured. But Caleb Jackson a year ago as a freshman carried the ball 31 times for 165 yards and 4 touchdowns. That's not going to be explosive numbers, but that averages 5.3 yards per carry. If Caleb Williams gets 200 rushing attempts this year, which is very possible, that's 1,060 yards. Like, Caleb Jackson, who we all saw obliterate some kid on the sideline against Mississippi State this past year, physically has the ability. He looks like running style like what Les Miles used to recruit, the big physical backs that also have breakaway speed. The guys like Jeremy Hill and Darius Geis, and dare I say Leonard Fournette. I'm not saying Caleb Jackson's Leonard Fournette. I'm just saying the big dudes that are physical between the tackles that can run you over, but also have the make you miss and breakaway speed. That's a dangerous combo, and Caleb Jackson has it. And I'm pretty excited to see what it looks like if he gets 200 rushes. I think Caleb Jackson, Josh Williams will platoon there as your lead backs. John Emery, of course, now has returned, and provided he's healthy, can be a nice change of pace. You have the freshman Caden Durham coming in, and we still don't know what's going to happen with Trey Holly. Again, the latest on the Trey Holly situation is that with the judge recusing himself in that case, it looks like the reports about a month ago up at WNOE was that it looks like an early mid-2025 trial. If that's the case, then maybe you don't have Trey Holly available this year. So you had to go bring John Emery back to get you a fourth scholarship running back. So I'm curious to see how Caden Durham looks, what John Emery has left in the tank coming off of injury. And of course, you know that Josh Williams is steady as she goes. But if you're looking at versatile skill set, game-breaking ability, etc., the breakout star for LSU in 2024 is Caleb Jackson. And we all agree. We want to see that kid get 200 carries this year to see what that looks like. And I have a feeling we're going to like it a lot, how it looks. So we're inching closer to the start of football season, but man, it's a busy time. We're into June. People say, oh, it's the dog days of summer. You'll never hear those words come out of my mouth. It never stops. We're talking LSU baseball, transfer portal. The draft is coming up. You're into the college football preseason before the talking season right now as well. It never ceases. And that's why I'm thrilled to be here hosting Locked On LSU. Again, if you're on the podcast, whatever podcast you're listening to, please subscribe. Do us a favor. Rate us, leave a review. Let a friend know if they love the Tigers. We got you here weekdays for Locked On LSU. And, of course, if you're on YouTube, do us a solid. Smash that like button. Subscribe to the Locked On LSU YouTube channel. We appreciate you for being there with us. Until next time, let me remind you, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And it's now available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV Channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now, available on the free Fire TV app. Our show today is brought to you by LinkedIn. We appreciate them for sponsoring this episode of Locked On LSU, and we appreciate you for being aboard with us. Until next time, this has been Locked On LSU, your team every day.